YouTube this afternoon. Shane says, if the Catholic Church is true and correct, why was there a need for the Protestant Reformation? Thank you, Dr. Anders. I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thanks. There was no need for the Protestant Reformation. We had it perfectly in hand. Thank you very much.
We did.
Yes, there's no need for it at all. All right, now, I speak on the Reformation whenever I have an opportunity. Unfortunately, the 500th anniversary has come and gone, so the speaking invitations about the Reformation have kind of dwindled.
Yeah.
But I had a big show in 2017. That was a lot of fun.
Okay.
But this was my area of research in grad school, so I know a thing or two about it. And when I'm speaking on the Reformation to a Catholic or Protestant audience, the question I like to ask folks is, why was there a Reformation? Why was there one? Why do you think? And almost invariably, it doesn't matter if I'm talking to Catholics or Protestants, the answer that I'll hear back from the audience is, well, because of all the corruption in the church. To which I respond, oh yeah? Well, what about all the corruption in the church in the 10th century? What about all the corruption in the church in the 4th century? What about all the corruption in the church among the company of the apostles? There's always been corruption in the church.
Always.
And sometimes quite severe, quite severe. It may be true that the church had corruption in the late 15th century, but that's not a sufficient explanation for why there was this social upheaval called the Reformation. It's far more complex than that. So in the monasteries of medieval Europe, when monasteries had become very established institutions, centuries old, settled into routines, it became, unfortunately, habitual that some of them, acquiring wealth and power and status, had fallen away from the rigorous application of the Benedictine rule. So you had monks kind of, doing the 9th century version of sitting around watching Netflix, popping popcorn, and not really attending to their prayers.
Yeah.
And so you had some reformers that popped up in the monasteries and said, we need to get back to the rule. We need to get back to the prayers. We need to get back to the observances of the Benedictine life. And this was especially so in a monastery called Cluny in France. They sort of spawned a reform movement among monasteries, Cluniac reform. Well, there's this fellow that came up out of the Cluniac reform. His name was Hildebrand. Lo and behold, he ends up in the papacy, becomes Gregory VII in the 11th century, in the 1000s.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, hey, that thing we did in the monasteries, we went back to the rule and we kind of tightened the ship up? What if we did that with the universal church? Wouldn't that be a good idea? So Hildebrand, in my judgment, is the man who starts the Reformation, 5 centuries before Luther, when not appealing to the Benedictine rule, but he appeals to the example of Christ and the apostles in the New Testament. And says, let's get the church back to its pristine purity of antiquity and sharpen up everybody's moral life. And that really kind of sets the mind of the church on fire with the ideology of reformism. The idea that, hey, the church needs to be reformed against an ancient model. That idea had to come from someplace. Actually comes from the papacy, from the Pope, not from Martin Luther, from Pope Gregory VII. And it inspired a whole lot of lay movements as well, the most important of which was the Franciscan Revolution of the 11th century, or of 12th century, early 13th century, and then the Dominican Reformation as well. The birth of the Catholic religious orders, a good 3 centuries before the Reformation. And what do these guys do? They went around Europe preaching fidelity to Christ and to the Scriptures, fidelity to the sacraments, and the reform of one's habits and morals. And they called out against corruption in the church. And so this thing is underway for 300 years. 300 years it's underway, until in Germany, one of these reforming religious orders, the Augustinian hermits, brings in this guy that has a funny personality, and his name is Martin Luther. So he is the heir of a good 300 years of Catholic reformism before the Reformation has ever seen the light of day. But there are other influences on Luther as well. Some developments in late medieval philosophy, some developments in late medieval mysticism, the invention of the printing press, the rise of the artisan classes throughout Europe, the printers, journeymen, the humanist movement, a rise of a money economy and the growth of the cities, and a degree of social dislocation and social anxiety that was different from earlier centuries in the church's history. And Luther breathed into that Catholic reformist movement some of his own idiosyncratic ideas that had a great revolutionary and propagandistic value to people that wanted to shake off the yoke of the Holy Roman Emperor or of the Pope. And so by adopting Luther's peculiar ideas, the Reformation was able to become a dissenting revolution that restructured the power centers of Western Europe in the early 16th century. But it's far too simplistic to suggest that it was merely a response to corruption.
Shane, great question. Thanks for checking us out today.